Well, the Smokey Saint comedy show has struck again. Did Smokey address any of our arguments? Well, he tried and he failed miserably. But the arguments he used were so hilariously bad that they may have even been worse and funnier than the first batch of arguments that we demolished 2 nights ago. Now he is saying that there is no evidence for design diversity and thus contradicting his own model. He's bringing up arguments pertaining to the fossil record and to bats and their levels of heterozygosity. I have to call Matt Man for this one. He is going to...
I'm here. Thanks for calling.
Matt,
what's going on?
Thanks for taking that call, Matt Man. I promise you won't regret it. If you were, enjoying a movie night or something with the family, I apologize, but it will be worth it. What's going on, brother?
Oh man, the usual, studying like crazy.
That'aboy. We've already got a great chat. We've already got a great audience. Let me see. We got a super sticker flying in. Steadfast and Easy says, "Good evening, all. God bless you. Go easy on the poor boy." Oh, we will. As you guys probably seen in the Praise says hilarious. Yes, guys, they say laughter's the best medicine. So at this rate, with these hilariously bad arguments being put forth by the critics, but specifically this time, the Smokey Saint comedy show, Matt, we may just live to 900 like our biblical patriarchs, because we're sitting here having a great time. And, the Smokey Saint comedy show, they're having a rough time. It's not looking too good for them. So as people can see in the description box, we pointed out that this is not a serious interlocutor that we're dealing with here. Okay. He has not brought anything new to the table, but since people enjoyed part 1, which is currently over 1,000 views, then given this individual's hilariously bad responses, we thought we would have some fun again in a part 2. Now, guys, views and things don't matter. The truth is important, okay? And the truth is not determined by views. But I want to point something out that this guy's been saying over and over again. And Matt, I know you're going to get a good laugh out of this. So he's been saying that teams standing for truth are being exposed to the world. The whole world is witnessing the great exposing of teams standing for truth. Okay, Matt? So let's go see the world that are being exposed, the world that is seeing. So here's good old Smokey's channel. Now remember, views and things like that don't determine truth. We just find it funny that he is saying it's empty threats. Okay, team standing for truth and their bad science and their bad X, Y, and Z, you name it, is being exposed for everybody to see. Well, here's his responses over the last week. So these last 1, 2, 3, 4 videos have been dedicated, for the most part, to yours truly, team standing for truth. I mean, as you can see here, we don't stand a chance. We're being, with these views. Here's what's funny. Take his last 4 responses, Matt, all the views combined, and just our one refuting really bad and weak arguments why Smokey Saint is low-hanging fruit. Our one video has more than his all combined. So if anything, the person who's being exposed to the world is Smokey Saint. Okay. So do you find that to be as ironic or as funny as I do, Matt?
Maybe he means the world as in local event, like the club.
Yeah, his localized little channel there, right?
Yeah. It's the same thing to them, right? Maybe, I don't know. Did he use the word arets?
You know,
I've told
I'm
them.
not. If you go back to the Hebrew, then
Right.
apparently, yes. Yeah.
Right,
So,
right.
so just a quick update before we get into this, into the party. Our website's coming along nicely. I got another update today. Should be ready in the next 4 or 5 days. We've got a new Meet the Team section. This is going to be epic. We're probably going to release. We'll be able to release the website in the next 5 days or so. In the Meet the Team section, you'll get full biographies of teams standing for truth. So definitely looking forward to showing you guys that. We are going to go through the section of Smokey Saint's video tonight where he attempted to rebut and failed rebut our last couple hour video. So that being said, let's see the chat. Caleb, $10 super sticker. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Steadfast and Easy says, good one, Matt Man. So let's see. Always a good chat. Godzilla Freak, SFT. World is local, obviously. Yeah. So if you guys haven't seen, just a few hours ago, we, as Prey says, the loud Chihuahua. So just a few hours ago, we had John Mackay, the creation guy, here, and completely demolished the local flood fairy tale, which was awesome. Kind of a teaser for our new book coming out next month. And we also were blessed to, within that hour and a half, debunk most of their favorite arguments against the flood: the Green River Formation, VARs, so-called heat problem, the too many species argument. So let's kind of get right into it, though. Guys, this will be detailed and informative, but remember, please check the part one to this, because we went for over 2 hours and it was data driven. We showed a lot of technical papers, we showed a lot of evidence, and we threw a lot of information at you. Okay, we kept it professional. Of course, we like to throw some jokes here and there, but that's something you won't find on Smokey's channel. So he did put out another video tonight, and I happened to catch the first 4 minutes, which actually attempted to address a few arguments, and then just the rest of the stream devolved into who knows what. A bunch of people join and just, nothing worthy. So we're going to address those 4 minutes. And yeah, Matt, what are your thoughts, brother, kind of before we kick this off?
Oh, no, this will be good. It's good that he addressed something, so this will be fun. 4 minutes, though, that doesn't, we can, believe me and you can talk for an hour about over 4 minutes on a subject. That's not going to be hard. But were these answers to questions, or were these just entirely new topics altogether?
You'll see. It's good. It's good. It's nothing that requires prep or anything like that. It really goes to show you why, when we enter the ring, especially in open mics and stuff with these theistic evolutionists and I guess old earth creationists, when it comes to Smokey, they don't do too well. They're not up to date on the literature. Here's one thing, Matt, that I'll point out. So, how Smokey and a lot of old earthers, how they've at least agreed, they've tapped out when it comes to the fact that mutations accumulate from generation to generation, and mutations result in negative variation, right? Like your scratches, your bumps, your rust marks on a car, right? Negative variation, not good variation.
Right.
And they lead to disease, they degenerate, right? Because the evolutionary model, they purport that the originator of all genetic variation for the most part is what? Mutations, right? Mm-hmm. And we start from the design variation starting point, because we know mutations lead to disease, mutations degenerate organisms. Now he has gone straight to evolutionist talking points, and he's saying there's no evidence for design variation. So do you see the contradiction already, Matt?
Yeah, he wants to have his cake and eat it too. It's all right. We'll remind him. We'll just remind him, because he forgot that you can't have both, right? It's like, which one is it? Is evolution adding genetic diversity with these mutations, like they say, these beneficial mutations accumulating over time and causing, or are they too few and far between, and there's too many step backwards to take one forward? That's all.
Think about it. Okay. If mutations lead to disease, mutations degenerate, and mutations don't result in new body plans. They don't result in true novelty. They're functionally compromising to organisms. My question to somebody like Smokey or an old earther that wants to deny design variation, how do you then explain, okay? How do you explain genetic variation and genetic diversity? If mutations are not the source for genetic variation and genetic diversity, then what is? Because if you don't want design diversity, but you don't want mutations, then what is there? So if there's anybody in the chat that holds to this kind of model, the question is, DNA differences across species, within species, what are they the result of? We'll see if we get an answer. But we know, according to the evolutionary model, they're the result of mutations. So what we see here is inconsistency, contradictions, simply to just disagree, right? And we are going to really, really tackle that. And another thing, Matt, that you'll see that this specific critic and other critics as well are saying, and I'd like to get your thoughts, is that we as young earth creationists, we believe in more evolution than the evolutionists. But how many times do we have to explain? Clearly, again, more times than we should have to. Evolutionists explain the origin of genetic diversity as being the result of mutations. So they require millions of years, okay, of mutations adding diversity for natural selection to then act upon. And for recombination and gene conversion, these types of genetic related processes to shuffle up those DNA variants. Creationists are saying, no, those DNA variants were front loaded. We have evidence to back that up, which we're going to get into. They were front loaded at creation. Now, you've had old earth creationists like Smokey admit, yeah, this had to be the case because mutations degenerate. Mutations lead to disease. We've seen this. So how then is that more evolution than the evolutionary model? Matt, can you expand on that, or what are your thoughts, brother?
Yeah, first of all, it can't be hyper evolution because we don't agree to the terms of even what they agree with when it comes to evolution. Remember, they're saying for a land animal like the size of a little badger that's related to a bear and a dog went into the ocean and it slowly became a whale over a long time, millions of years, because of beneficial mutations. We're saying we agree that mutations are happening, but that scenario can't take place because, one, we don't believe in the mechanism of beneficial mutations taking that creature to that. So how in the world can we say that happened quickly? Because if we said that same scenario did happen quickly, we would be literally watching that process happen in front of our eyes, but we don't. We're watching the process of speciation happen quickly. We're watching the process of diversity happen quickly. We're watching epigenetic modifications happen so quickly, and then in one lifetime, something can move somewhere. Epigenetics will change it, alter its ability to live in that environment before mutations can ever,
I was going to say, and that genetic variation is already present.
Right. Already there.
Right.
Exactly.
The capacity is there.
Right. It's already built in. And then when new mutations start rolling in that new environment, sure, you'll get something, maybe that blue eyes will pop up, and you'll get a new genetic, natural selection will act upon it. But it's already after epigenetics has allowed the creature to already live in the environment. You can't even get migration without rapid adaptation to an environment. So adaptation and evolution are two different things, but they equivocate the words. So they say, see, you believe in evolution too. It's just equivocation. It's a wordplay game because remember, to them, evolution just means change. It's such a broad spectrum word that I evolved when I walked out of the kitchen, apparently, because I changed. My hair's a little longer, my nails are longer, but it doesn't obviously mean I evolved in any way, shape, or form. So.
Right. Exactly. And let me give a lesson to Smokey Saint here. Another lesson. Okay. He's being taken back to school. We'll see if he accepts correction. When it comes to epigenetics, now I've had many debates on this. You have as well. I debated Derek Barnes on this months ago probably about a year ago now on Modern Day Debate, and we discuss epigenetics. We know epigenetics points us back to a forward thinker, okay? Because natural selection acts on the short term, not the long term, right? Natural selection worries about us surviving till tomorrow, not about getting cancer 50 years from now.
Right.
So therefore, how does selection build that which requires long-term thinking or long-term planning? That's what epigenetics are. We have millions of switches in our genome just waiting to be turned on via environment. It's kind of like a spare tire, where the evolutionists or naturalists would look to a spare tire as meaningless, as junk, as meaningless redundancy. We know a spare tire at the back of a car requires forward planning, forward thinking. In case one of the tires gets a flat, we now have that spare tire. We're thinking ahead due to environmental conditions, okay? So that's what we see in the genome. We see a lot of redundancy. We see this extra layer of complexity known as the epigenome. Evolutionists cannot explain how that originates. Now, how they attempt to and fail is they'll say, here's the lesson, Smokey, is they'll say that mutations that are absolutely neutral build up over time. They build up over millions of years. They build up as junk. Now, the genomes of living organisms have a hidden reservoir of genetic baggage to call upon at some point in a species history, depending on the environment. And apparently that genetic baggage or that hidden reservoir of neutral mutations can lead to some type of advantage, right? But now they're giving evolutionary mechanisms a mind, right? Which they won't come right out and say, but they can actually show you, just like orphan genes, right? These taxonomically restricted and essential genes, they'll hypothesize all day how they could arise from non-coding areas of the genome, but they can't actually demonstrate that. So once again, okay, it just shows their lack of knowledge, their lack of ability to formulate a decent, coherent argument. Evolutionists, let me say this again, require millions of years of mutations that they say are mostly neutral, which we know has been overturned. They're actually nearly neutral and slightly deleterious. So that's no help to the evolutionists. So they'll say that millions of years of mutations that are neutral have to build up. So then mechanisms like selection can utilize that genetic variation for speciation events, for adaptive episodes. No. The creationist says that genetic variation was front-loaded at creation. Mutations are deleterious. Mutations are damaging. They're not useful. The useful variation is front-loaded. The useful variation is created variation, is created heterozygosity. Therefore, in one single generation, because the variation is already built in, all we need is recombination and gene conversion to produce new varieties quickly. The DNA variants are already built in. Then for speciation, what do you need, Matt? As we said and explained last time, you have breakaway populations, populations that migrate, become isolated. They start inbreeding. You get shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity. You have a greater potential at first, right? Heterozygosity means a state of DNA diversity. You get shifts from that to homozygosity, a state of no DNA diversity. You're losing the allelic potential. You're losing the potential for more change and adaptation. So this is not evolution in the sense of large-scale evolution. Okay, the evolutionists, what do they have to explain? They have to explain how the four-dimensional genome with multiple overlapping codes that's nested and abundant in meta information came about. The creationist knows that that can't be explained, that can't happen, so it was created that way. Okay? And the genome set of instructions is not just this simple linear array of letters. It's multidimensional, it's self-regulating, it's dynamic. Okay? We write books, but we don't write books that can be read both forwards and backwards. DNA can. Or in the DNA code, you could read every other letter and get a message. You can read it forwards, get a different message, and read it backwards and get a whole nother message. 3 messages in one. It's multidimensional. Okay? So this uneducated Smokey Saint who does not have the ability to formulate an actual argument that makes sense and doesn't contradict his position, when he says that creationists believe in hyperevolution, he has no idea what he's talking about. And that's why he's low-hanging fruit. But because the audience likes it, and they had a lot of fun during the last show, okay, we're going to do it again. We're going to do it again. Also, Matt, as you know, and you can expand on this before we get into the video, when it comes to the evolutionary model, they need to explain the origin of phenotypic complexity, right? Phenotypic variation, the type of variation that we actually see through like this microevolutionary variation. That doesn't explain major innovations or these body plans, major new forms of life that we see in like the Cambrian. Okay, no, those mechanisms lack explanatory power in explaining true anatomical novelty. Yeah, they can explain morphological changes, but not true anatomical changes or anatomical novelty. They don't explain new body structures, new body plans. That's why everything we see points back to this model of design diversity, design variation, where the capacity is already there for these changes. And as time goes on, the capacity reduces because now you have lesser levels of heterozygosity. So since we've explained that now about 1 million times, we'll see if this argument is still used. Before we go to the clip, brother, yeah, anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I liked what you were talking about as far as the you mentioned about loss over time. And one of the things is I read a study quite a while ago. I found it when you were talking, was that they studied 185 human genomes. And this is just in one place. I believe it was like Denmark, Norway, or Sweden, somewhere up there in the north. And they found over 1,285 broken genes in those 185 people. And 100 of those, that means 100 genes per person was broken on average. That means that every person has 100 broken genes that you know that, and most of us share them. So I want to ask the audience, is it any surprise that we have genes that are weaker that break in all of us? And then why is that a surprise if we look inside of another animal like a chimpanzee and see the same broken genes? Because you'll oftentimes hear Aaron Ross say, we have defective monkey genes inside of us. Well, these are just genes that are weaker than other ones. For example, would you expect your car to wear out first? Probably the tires, right? So does that mean that if the tires wear down on another car, that, well, they're related because they wear down there quickly? It's like, well, I'll have a bike that wears down tires first as well. So the car isn't the same as the bike, but it just happens that that's what comes in contact with the ground, so it's going to wear out first. Well, there's genes in us that aren't as strong, but they're required, but they have backup. They're redundancy. That's why we don't die when these genes break. There's a redundancy backup plan for when they do. But do no cars not need tires? Of course they do. But it's just like we have these genes in us. They're required, but there's backups for when they do break. So when we see these defective monkey genes, are they really shared genes that are part of primates and human beings that we now are saying, well, man, we are related to these primates because they have those broken genes and we have those broken genes? Well, no, this study just proved that particular genes are weaker in everything, and humans just happen to break down with them as well. So when they're broken in us and we find them, and then we look at a primate and we find them, we go, oh, it must be shared common ancestry. No, it's just they're weaker genes. That's what we just discovered. So it's pretty fascinating to me that when they test these human beings, we're seeing a genome decaying over time. And you got to remember, humans have a large generation time. We don't have kids until 25, 30 years old. Amish, 35, 40. They keep going with it. They breed until they can't do it anymore. So if we have long generation times and we look at an animal or a species that has a younger generation time, imagine how much genome loss would be in them. The numbers would be much higher, much higher. Humans only have 20,000 genes, somewhere around 18,000, they think, but we'll just go with 20 make the numbers easy. We don't have that many genes in us overall. So pretty amazing.
And that's actually, save that. Okay.
Okay.
Because he puts forth this argument about bats and levels of heterozygosity, okay, and looks to the size of the bat genome and says this is a refutation of created heterozygosity, which is a fulfillment of our predictions from our last show, because I pointed out how we have had numerous debates on this. I've had between 80 and 100. This bat argument is something I debated with CRISPR over 3 years ago. So, point is, we're dealing with low-hanging fruit, but these arguments are so hilariously bad, even though we've debunked them 1,000 times over. Let's have some fun, right? Laughter is the best medicine. To back up what you're saying, brother, right here, Alexei Kondrashov in the Crumbling Genome. In the average human genome, over 100 genes are dysfunctional or altogether missing, and over 1,000 genes are substantially impaired. So it was Caleb that was perfectly saying in the chat right here, Smokey is probably a closet evolutionist, said that somewhere, or maybe it was Praise that said that. Yes, it sounds like it, because he wants to now fight design variation, right? The fact that God would have designed the original organisms and therefore design them with internal diversity. I mean, does Smokey just think there's the phenotype, the outward appearance, with no underlying proteins, DNA, RNA, coding genes, non-coding genes? Obviously, if the creatures were designed, then they would have had to be designed with what? Internal genetic diversity.
How to be made of something.
Designed with DNA, RNA, proteins. I mean, is this really what we're dealing with here? So if he wants to then say or attack design diversity, but what we know about mutations, as we've seen there, leads to disease, breaks down functional complexity, they're functionally compromising to organisms. Well, what is it? Did this variation come about through mutations, or did it come about through design means?
Smokey's not theistic evolution by any means, though. He's old Earth creation. So
right. So he's contradicting himself.
He would believe that, humans were created, but God didn't recreate the layout plan for how we were going to be made. He would just reuse it. It's like making a computer program and building the ultimate system and then saying, you know what, I'm going to start over with every animal on Earth. It just wouldn't do that, right? He would just take the general plan and just distribute it among all life. And that's what we see. That's why there's only 22 amino acids. Minerals, there's around 100. There's not that much to share in general overall. So of course we're going to see the same things in all life. And evolutionists like to use that as like, oh, that's proof of common ancestry. It's like, well, what do you expect? Yeah, I mean, we're made out of the dust of the ground, just like the animals were. So yeah, I mean, of course.
Remember, right, exactly what you said, brother. Spot on. A lot of these intelligent design advocates who we support and we learn a lot from, they're old earthers, but they recognize that the evidence suggests design variation. Right. They recognize that mutations don't add beneficial variation. I mean, we know that these non-protein coding RNAs, okay, we discuss frequently how they literally regulate almost all aspects of the gene expression pathway. Okay, I mean, we can go into functions pertaining to pseudogenes, ERVs, ALU sequences, introns, orphan genes, whatever, you name it. So even intelligent design advocates that believe in an old Earth recognize that all of this did not come about through mutations. But now Smokey wants to attack that, which now puts him between a rock and a hard place. So I'd like to hear an answer is, how do you explain the origin of genetic variation for the most part? Is it mutations, or was this variation designed? If he says designed, now he's contradicting himself with his arguments, right? Do you see how these old earthers kind of have a problem? Now, if they admit that it's designed, now they have to admit that adaptive episodes can happen quickly, rapidly, since the variation is already front-loaded and you don't need millions of years to add it, right? See, to us, this makes sense. To the audience, this makes sense. But to the critics, it's like you need to hit them over the head with a hammer 1,000,000 times before they actually get it. But I think a lot of them do get it, but they don't want to admit that they're wrong. So they got to keep repeating the same arguments, refuse to get it. Anyways, Matt, before I play this video, brother, do you have any, I know we got a ton to say, so
yeah, it's all good.
All right, man. So this is the first time you're hearing it. So I'm going to play it all the way through, and then we will, and then we'll discuss it. And then we'll go over the evidence for design variation as well. Here we go. Guys in the chat, let us know that the sound is good.
That I don't hold, and says that he won't respond to me until I go back into his refutation and pull up all the arguments he made against a model that I don't hold. The bird species thing, the speciation in general thing. This is not a secret that young Earth creationists believe in hyper-evolution, the most extreme form of evolution you have ever seen. And how do they explain this? Miraculously, incredibly packed front-loaded genomes. All the information of all the descendant animals are packed into these creatures. Which ones are they? Well, they wouldn't know without looking through morphology, which they seemingly do try to do. You got 250,000 species in the fossil record, 99% of which are extinct. All of the major phyla, all of the major terrestrial phyla already present in the Cambrian explosion. I would poke at the evolutionists that if indeed the Cambrian explosion event is indeed maxing out at around 5 million years, not the Cambrian period, I'm talking about the Cambrian explosion, that specific event of massive complex speciation all across the globe. That even in a 5 million year window, that's a tall order. That presents to me evidence of the idea of some sort of special creation event. That not all of that complexity manifested through a series of deleterious mutations of simpler life. That argument doesn't hold as much water to me as God clearly engaging in a series of miraculous creation events with complex speciation already present and created in its functional form. But no.
Wait a minute, Smokey, and I'm going to let the rest of it play. There's so many wrong things said. There's more things wrong in each one of his sentences than words that are in that sentence, right? Which is why we can really just talk about this for hours and hours. And I just want to make sure you can hear me. Okay, good. So he's admitting that God would have had to, especially because of the Cambrian explosion, we talk a lot about that as well, had to through a miracle, through supernatural means, had to design organisms. What that means, design organisms would also have designed internal genetic variation, right? Which is evidenced by the evidence that the genome is near fully functional, and we're going to get into that later. So it's just a contradiction to his model, and you see that he still said that we believe in hyperevolution. We already addressed that, but you know what? We're going to have him finish his thoughts here, and then we're going to comment on it all. Just a second.
No, they have to talk about kinds and some sort of genetic front-loaded progenitor, which I don't even really know. I don't generally hear much evidence presented for this other than the fact that here, this animal somewhere on Earth exists and has this, so maybe. There's a progenitor species they could maybe point to morphologically and say, look, it's got a very, very heavy loaded genome, therefore progenitor species. What about the bats? How many hundreds of species of bats, all with genomes so incredibly loaded that they couldn't possibly have progenitors? What about them? There's a signification. There's a sign of hey, standing. There's a prediction. There's a prediction you would expect to find in my model, pre-created speciation that can't be front-loaded. There you go. There's one. There's a predictable part of my model. Bats. Bats are a rough one for you. How about the other thing that you avoid?
Matt, as we get through the rest of this, I know it's tough. It's difficult. What do you think he means by this pre-existing species? I don't think he really knows what he's talking about. Pre-existing speciation. What does that mean to you? I think you're on mute, brother.
Thanks. I'm really on it, huh? I would say I think this is from Rob as well. lions have always been lions, and tigers have always been tigers, and cheetahs have always been cheetahs. So species were created by God from the beginning. There was no original cat kind that created the cats that we see in the world today. For them, speciation is something that really just doesn't really occur. So change maybe a little bit here and there, but overall, animals have remained the same. That's why in that one video we did with Rob talking about, he said, if we look into Egypt, we see a picture of a lion on the wall. There's no way that lion should have been there, because he believes that the lion already existed. So Smokey's model is like the old Earth creation model, where those animals already existed,
Right.
and they were created and designed and do not change. So his model would say it doesn't need as much front-loaded genetic diversity because they were already created in the form that didn't require that much, because they're the same as they are now.
Right. But the diversity that would have been there in these original created species would have had to been created. Even the old earthers would have to admit that. I wouldn't imagine that Smokey and these old earthers would say that the original created species were created with deleterious mutations. They would also have to agree that there was pre-existing genetic variation. Now, maybe they'll say there wasn't as much because God created your black bear, your polar bear, your brown bear, whatever.
They would actually benefit from saying there was too much, because they now have to account for millions of years of genetic mutations building up. So if the larger genome was there, it could erase the genes, and it could erase the genome and break it down, and they can get away with it. So actually, they would want a larger genome size in the beginning.
They'd need to, because they need a lot of redundancy. They need a lot of junk just to absorb these mutations that are accumulating, because the mutations put shelf lives on genomes, right? So we see these organisms that have not changed at all, or just very little, in supposedly millions and millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. Well, we know based on mutation accumulation, low impact deleterious mutation accumulation today, that could not be the case, because those species would be extinct. So here's my question before we finish this then. It sounds like to me there's a straw man argument. And I have noticed this, Matt, and I wonder if you have, with the old earthers and the theistic evolutionists. They think the whole two of every kind applies to the creation event as well. When we've made it clear that from scripture, at creation event, let's say 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, God would have created populations of animals in fully functioning ecosystems. You wouldn't have just two bats. You wouldn't have just two felids. You wouldn't have just two canids. You'd have populations, and therefore many different kinds of these animals.
Well, we do see in the scripture, it says God created the bird kind. Clearly, he didn't create a dove, and a eagle came from it, right? So obviously he made birds in bulk. So I'm sure that there are birds that are extinct that we will no longer have. That is obvious. Everything that we now have obviously came and survived the flood. Now, if it was local, then they would have things that could easily have survived from the time of the dinosaurs. If things didn't change, obviously they don't believe a Tyrannosaurus Rex evolved into a chicken, but that's what the genetic evidence would say happened. So therefore, they would have to say, since things don't change, how come none of those creatures that existed in the time of the dinosaurs would be alive today, except for some of these? I'll give you an example. Living fossils. Some of those were found to exist because, again, didn't die in the flood, or they were on the ark. Simple for us to answer. But a living fossil, they would have to say, why aren't there more? Why didn't a lot of things survive from this deep era in time? Because the flood was just local. And if species don't change, then how come we have species that we look in the fossil record and we go, well, look, they've changed. They're the same kind, but there's, we still see their lineage alive today, but they're a little bit different. Is it a new species? Is it a species that God created that survived as well for those millions of years? Like, there's a lot of questions for me. I really didn't know too much about old Earth creation because we never really dealt with them. I just thought they were on our side with things. And they just thought that all life was young, just like we do. and that the earth was created old. Literally day 1 and 2 of creation were very old. And then day, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, those were quick, just like us. So when I'm hearing new arguments, they are different between old earth creationists as well. So some will believe, oh no, man's just 6,000 years old, right? That's fine. But earth, no, that's millions. Or others will say, no, mankind isn't 6,000 years old. That's just Adam and Eve. Man's existed for hundreds of thousands of years. So I'm really, I would say that unfortunately,
we're kind of all over the place.
Yeah, I don't like to be confused on things, and unfortunately I am. I admit that.
And here's what's funny is, as we laid out, the creation model would say populations of animals were created at creation. So then you have a couple thousand years for the flood. So you have speciation events leading up to that, which started off with populations of animals, which the old earthers also say populations of animals, different species were created, just like we say. So when we look to these numbers, right, today, 1.6 million species on Earth, aquatic, tens of thousands of species, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds, only roughly 34,000, right? Felids, 37. We point out over and over again that there's not that many species today. So from the arc, we have a bare archetype where you've got all those front-loaded DNA differences that can then lead to, through recombination, gene conversion, migration, isolation, inbreeding, shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity with some mutations added into the mix, we can easily get the living bear species today, easily, okay? Now, when you go to the fossil record, you're dealing with species, populations of species that would have been buried, that would have been formed from the original created kinds or species thousands of years prior. The planet would have been filled with plants. And when you look at the fossil record, it's exactly what we'd expect given the creation event. And we made predictions which were never addressed. We made predictions. God created Adam and Eve, and then he created fully functioning ecosystems with animals. So animals would then be able to harbor more genetic diversity and humans less. Today, what do we see? Animals, for the most part, have higher levels of genetic diversity. Humans have low genetic diversity. So it correlates perfectly. The numbers correlate perfectly. Notice how we put forth numbers. We put forth the technical papers. I mean, we had a presentation by a PhD paleontologist that pointed out the discontinuities that are found in fossil groups like Dinosauria, mammal-like reptiles. These fossil groups show barriers and discontinuities, which points back to created kinds. Have they ever read this paper from the Proceedings of the International Conference on Creationism? Doubtful. Yeah, go ahead, brother.
That's a great paper.
Great, exactly. Then we always point out the genetic boundaries study with the CO1 gene, that highly conserved mitochondrial DNA protein that is conserved across species, low genetic diversity, right? Everything went through a bottleneck. I mean, we dealt with all these arguments in the last broadcast, and none of them have been addressed. And all we see here is misunderstanding, straw man arguments, really just laughably bad. So here, let me play the rest of it, and then we're just going to go right back to the beginning. And we'll deal with it all. I'm going to get your thoughts as well. Okay, brother? Okay. Especially on this bats argument. So just 1 second.
Boy, I got timed out in standings chat for mentioning the freaking olive tree again. He timed me out after I mentioned the olive tree. He asked me about the olive tree because clearly he says he's completely refuted me, and in the same breath says he ignores my content. How does that make sense? How does that make sense? Help me with that. What the hell are you on about, Taylor? I heard you need clarification on your paternity. That's I think you heard wrong. I don't know quite what that's about. Why? Are they claiming I'm the Antichrist or something now? What's that about? Father Satan or something? I don't know where that's going. So anyway, I do have an argument to present. It is one, again, another one that they're going to run from, ignore. I mean, in the same breath says he ignores my content and I'm not worth it and isn't going to watch my shows. And then says in the same breath, he's refuted me. He's seen all my arguments and he knows and he's refuted. Do you see the bombastic arrogance?
And he never ends up actually, it's funny because he never ends up actually put the next hour is just like some open mic and like everyone's arguing over different things, the Trinity and doctrine and stuff. We never do get an argument. And yeah, we have demolished every single one of his arguments. We have seen the arguments he's presented. Okay. And we have put forth challenges and arguments to him and the other critics, and we have yet to get a response. This was the best that we could get in terms of his argumentation. His previous 3 streams were those arguments mixed in within the 3 to 4 hours. So the second I saw him compile them into 4 minutes worth of arguments at the beginning of his show tonight, I thought this is perfect. All in one, as compared to having to fight through all his different 3 to 4 hour streams, finding, you know, the actual minute or two where he attempts to address something. So what are your thoughts overall, brother? You know, he said a lot there. No evidence for design variation, apparently. We believe in hyperevolution. We already dealt with that ad nauseum. Said that bat species have too much levels of heterozygosity, that you could never have a bat archetype because that bat archetype would be overloaded, apparently, with genetic variation. So what are your thoughts, brother?
Yeah. Sorry, I did get. I'll admit I got distracted by a guy named Zach in the comment section who asked how there could be layers of thick plant material that makes oil and things like that 5 miles down under the ground in the model of catastrophic plate tectonics, for example. Since each model is different, hydroplate theory is going to give you a different answer. Catastrophic plate tectonics is going to tell you quick subduction. But there's also the fact that the global flood itself would have mixed up multiple layers, and that there would have been lots of sediments moved around from ocean current itself. So to give you an example of that, the KT boundary, which would be considered part of the after the flood event from worldwide volcanism that threw out a cloud of iridium around the world, rather than a meteor strike hitting the peninsula in Mexico that did it. That is 12 miles down. So that layer would actually be the flood layer. And then you're talking about layers on top of that. So we're just talking about a whole lot being mixed around all together, and things were being dragged down with subduction in subduction zones. But when it comes to how oil was made, that's pressure, that's conditions, and the conditions that would have been during the flood would have been massive amounts of sediments brushing over plant life and animal life, burying them and crushing them down. Now, not everything that's crushed turned into oil. For example, we know that the lot was fossilized. So, sorry, that was completely out of left field. That had nothing to do with what you're talking about today. So I will backwind. His first comment that I took a note on was no speciation. We touched on that for a minute, and then he said there were 250,000 species in the pre-flood world. Well, yeah, sure, pre-flood world. We'll just say that in the fossil record that are extinct. Okay, species, again, species are different. We believe going from an animal family, you would get multiple species from that. For example, let's say there's around 50 to 55 dinosaur families. Then, okay, we have how many dinosaur species from the Tyrannosaurus rex family that could have come from? Not sure what the basal ancestor root was, not too into dinosaurs, but really what you get is about 5 T-Rex species in that family. So we believe that they could have diverged from that. So we would explain the different dinosaurs that would come. And we're talking about a Tyrannosaurus Rex. What's their generation time? It's around 19 years. That's what they predict anyway. It's the longest. It's the highest. So I picked the one with the highest generation time, so that it would explain why there was only about 5 families. I'm sorry, 1 family and 5 species of that kind. But we can move over and get into the numbers now for you to explain a huge chunk of those 250,000, and that would be the trilobites. So if we look at trilobites, how many species do we find when we're looking in the fossil record? We see about 20,000. Now, 20,000 is a lot. Did God create all 20,000 species of trilobites? Maybe. I wasn't there. But in our model, he created probably like one, and it went around the world, diversifying. Not around the world, I'm sorry. We've only found their fossils kind of around the Denmark, Norway, Sweden coast. And then when the continents ripped apart, it brought a lot of them down into South America. So, and it's along the northeast ridge of the South America. So another reason we believe the continents were more ripped apart during Pangea, and it was fast because it pulled those fossils with it as it happened. If that were millions of years, we wouldn't believe that those fossils would have remained in the same layer at the same height with the same species exactly in the same region. It just doesn't really make much sense. So the reason we believe now that speciation would have happened very rapidly is because, before I get into the flounders, let's explain the why it was so quick in something like a trilobite. Well, trilobites have a fast generation time. So this is going to be kind of technical, I'm sorry, but I wrote everything down for everybody as well, so I can even share what I wrote, because I answered this question for Emotionally Stunted Emoticon when he said, how in the world could there have been 20,000 species of trilobites in a couple thousand year period before the flood actually hit and wiped everything out? And it's actually answered with how fast they have offspring. It's really, really easy. So how I would say is that I think the question that Smokey is asking is, how in the world can there have been 250,000 species? So if 20,000 of these were trilobites, and I'm going to explain how quickly they can form a species and how quickly they diverge, maybe it'll make sense, I hope. So I chose the trilobite because of the sheer number, and the numbers really help his argument too, because there's so many of them. So we're going to first look at flounders. In the Baltic Sea, they've diverged basically into two different lineages over hundreds of subspecies and different hybrids. So they have a generation time of about 3 years. And we see that the flounders with left eyes, there's about 100 species, and the flounders that have right eyes have about 240. So literally, it's the species that went onto the bottom of the ocean and just laid down on their side, and their eye moved over a little, or they were created that way. It's pretty cool. Anyway, they have a generation time of just 3 years, and they only have a couple young. So in reality, you're not going to get a lot of species, and that's exactly what we see in the world today. There's about 340 species that are alive today, nowhere near 20,000, because they have a 3-year generation time. Now, let's look at the trilobites. Trilobites are interesting because they lay eggs, and they lay hundreds, maybe they laid thousands at a time. Now, this is also a huge difference because you're not getting that with flounders. So we found in the fossil record in 1994, they found a trilobite that had inside of it eggs, and it was giving birth as it was buried and crushed and fossilized perfectly. So the eggs are still there. So if they're anything like a horseshoe crab, which scientists believe that they are, then they're a subspecies. That means that they go through what are called 16 or 17 molts, M-O-L-T-S, I believe. And these molts are when they have offspring. So literally for like 16 or 17 times in their life, maybe once a year, I'm not sure, maybe more, they literally have offspring where they lay hundreds and hundreds of eggs. So we have short generation times, multiple generations, and hundreds of eggs being laid as they travel around the ocean. So we got a lot of diversity. And we also have to remember the pre-flood world was extremely beneficial for animals to live. There was more oxygen, there was more magnetism. It would have been very conducive for animals to thrive better, just like it would have been better and more conducive for man to live longer and better as well. So if we see, there's nothing really like that today. Just the one species that would have made it through, which would have been a horseshoe crab. But nothing like the trilobite. So there's nothing we can really test. But the numbers show that having such a fast generation time and having so many eggs that it lays, we would find and expect a lot more diversity, and that is what we see. So I can go back to the numbers for you, okay?
Have you noticed that when we do our responses, we give the numbers, the data, the technical papers, we back up everything we say, and we give testable predictions, and we show technical papers from the secular side and the creationist side. But what do we get from the critics, and especially this critic from Smokey? You get none of that. None of that. You get 4 minutes of a rant. Anyways, I just wanted to point that out, brother. So I'll keep going.
Well,
You're doing
he's
great.
also mad too, so you can't. Sometimes you don't think clear when you're mad. You know, you don't give the best answers. I know if I was pissed right now, I wouldn't be telling you.
No, you can't think straight.
I
Right.
couldn't tell you how many species of trilobites there are. Okay, so we can jump over to ants, because ants are cool. Ants might be a good way. Now, we have to remember, land life is not like aquatic life. For some reason, aquatic life can diversify extremely quick. Maybe it has to do with the temperatures of the oceans and how the current can pull them around the world and allow them to be in different environments. And then a lot of things near the equator have more variety. And then you get near the poles, there's less variety, but there's more life. It's very, very unique. So the ocean has a lot more diversity than land. So that can also lend to more speciation. But if we look at land, we still can see the numbers that are very similar to the trilobites. Now, there's an estimated 10 billion, that's right, not billion, 10 billion ants alive today, with over 12,000 different species. They actually don't even know how many there are. They stopped. They're like, just there's more than 12. I guess because it's really hard to count an ant species, because they have to be different and they're so small. It's not like you can hold one up unless you're like a complete specialist and be like, oh yeah, that's sucker. That's a different one right there. That would take a really good eye. Something not interested in, so I couldn't do it. But if each ant colony, now how many eggs does a queen lay? In just 1 to 2 days, a queen will lay 300,000 eggs per colony. Now imagine the diversity from an ant that got off the ark. I don't think ants were brought on the ark, but okay, so what if they were? You're talking about ants that would get off of debris floating on the waters, or that came off of an ark, and the ants are walking around the world, and they're creating little dens as they go around, and they're like, this is perfect, I'll live here. And then another ant walks 20 feet away and they make a den, and it keeps happening until they're around the world. They are so big in population size that their biomass of the world is 3,000. That's million tons, by the way. 3,000 million tons of ants exist. That's an insane number. But the reason that can happen is because they have offspring so quickly and so fast, and they speciate so much. And literally, a queen having 300,000 eggs in just a couple days, and it happens every year, that explains the diversity that we see in the world today. And so I believe that the same thing is true with the trilobites. So if we can explain it with ants that are on land that have less diversity than anything in the ocean would have, and then I think it would be an explainable scenario to show in the past. The unfortunate part about all of this is I can never test it and I can never prove it, because the old world is gone. And that old world, being extremely saturated in oxygen and magnetism, is something that they actually do reproduce in Texas at the Dr. Carl Bogue, which we're trying to get on the show, by the way. I think George is putting that together for everybody. So stay tuned if he comes on the show, because we are going to bombard that guy with questions. And he has a hyperbaric biodome, not a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. It's a biodome where he grows piranhas in there in the old world, and different types of animals and insects. So it's going to be fascinating to see if he can cause new species to take place. I know that's not his goal, but I'm going to ask if it could be, because all he has to do is change the environment enough to cause a new species to fight for supremacy in the new changing environment, and you'll have a new species. And then if it can happen that quickly, then we can say rapid speciation happened in a hyperbaric biodome in 1 year in his chamber. I mean, you talk about an awesome thing. I mean, literally, you can prove a prediction that Dr. Jensen was having, saying hyperspeciation. But you see, I think that the problem comes from, I noticed he said it there. He believes that hyperspeciation is hyperevolution. And
yes, yeah, that's the key.
Yeah, that was the key right there. So that's the only difference. I can understand his quorum then. So,
but remember, it's a strong misunderstanding, as we spent for the first like 30 minutes pointing out what evolution, large scale, goo to you, fish to fisherman evolution requires. It requires uphill changes. It requires true novelty. But we know mutations don't lead to true novelty. Mutations are generally functionally compromising. Speciation events that we see are due to a reduction. Reductive mechanisms aren't going to take a single-celled like ancestor into a whale. So it's intellectually dishonest to say that we believe in hyperevolution when in fact it's quite the opposite. We start with the genetic variation front-loaded. Okay, we start with designed organisms. We even look to the Cambrian explosion as evidence for this. Evolutionists start with a single-celled like ancestor where over millions and millions of years, mutations add genetic variation that can finally be utilized by evolutionary mechanisms. Complete opposite. And that's why, Matt, I'll just add this here. I'm going to share screen. There have been predictions on this model, okay? A few different predictions. One of them is the type of speciation. And I recommend anybody who has not seen part 1, please check that out. We spent a great deal of time going over the mechanisms of speciation, including the predictions from young Earth creationists on how these speciation events should take place if the created heterozygosity model were true. And those changes should be the result of shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity, right? Because we'd have more heterozygous ancestors at creation, more heterozygous ancestors at the flood. And through shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity, we'd have species today with lesser levels of that genetic variation, okay? And we showed with Darwin's finches, we showed that that's exactly, Matt, you even screen shared it, brother. That's exactly what happened on a genotypic level, was that type of shift is exactly what was observed. So anyways, the front-loaded genetic variation model, that organisms were front-loaded with internal genetic diversity, which can explain the origin of species today, okay, for the most part. That Smokey says there's no evidence for. Well, that's funny because we've made predictions. Dr. Nathaniel Jensen made predictions years and years ago on it. He points out, and then we're going to demolish this claim from Smokey. So Jensen said, once the animals stepped off the ark, their reservoir of DNA differences, right, because these DNA differences were front-loaded at creation. Thousands of years later, God probably brings on the most heterozygous ancestors. So you'd get 2 archetypes out of a greater population of this kind. Okay. So he points out their reservoir of DNA differences could have easily translated. And when you understand recombination gene conversion, which a lot of these critics don't, when you understand these mechanisms, when you understand that selection actually sorts out genetic information over time, selection is a fine-tuning mechanism. When you understand what results with these DNA differences when they're subject to recombination, you understand that, yes, they could have easily translated into a massive amount of morphological change. This fact is best illustrated by a consideration of a recent objection to the young Earth creation view of speciation. Over a decade ago, one of the main complaints that could be levied was based on the function. Now, our old Earth creationists, I know intelligent design advocates wouldn't, but is Smokey so desperate to actually have an argument, which he hasn't had one argument yet, and that which he has put forth has been laughably bad. is he actually going to hold to the evolutionist position that says that the vast majority of our genome is junk? I've debated a number of biologists, and they'll say max, you've got 10 to 20% of the genome that's actually functional, when we know that it's actually over 80% of the genome that's active, which has led to testable predictions. So are they really going to sink that low and say, yes, the vast majority of the genome is junk just to have an argument? I certainly hope not. So right here, the function of the DNA letters, because remember, an obvious prediction of front-loaded DNA differences would be that these DNA differences in the vast majority of genetic sequences should then be functional and essential and not junk, not useless, not the result of millions of years of common descent with modification, right? That's why the evolutionary model predicts, since they hold to descent with modification, they predict that the vast majority of the genomes of living organisms are the result of genomic fossils. They'd predict genetic baggage, evolutionary leftovers. They'd predict vast amounts of ancient viral infections like ERV, so on and so forth. They'd predict pseudogenes, right? Well, we predict function. Okay, so here we go. Actually, it was the apparent lack of function of DNA differences. Right here. When the sequence of the billions of human DNA letters were first elucidated in 2001, many in the scientific community concluded that the vast majority was junk, useless leftovers from the human evolutionary process. Presumably, similar amounts of junk DNA existed in other species as well. However, this claim was not based on rigorous laboratory testing of the billions of DNA letters in the human DNA code. Instead, it was based on appearance to evolutionary scientists. The DNA looked as if it were non-functional. Since 2001, a large body of laboratory, example experimental, evidence has accumulated. While preliminary and largely biochemical, this evidence has a trajectory suggesting that the vast majority of human DNA is, in fact, functional. Now, here I want to dismantle a straw man that I've heard. I've heard a straw man argument from, I've heard it, where they will say, oh, young Earth creationists are wrong because they'll say that all the DNA is functional. We know this, it's a fact. No, we've been clear. The data that we have is preliminary. It's largely biochemical, as in it suggests activity. Okay, so we've never said it's a fact, but because of the preliminary data and because of the trajectory being so strongly in favor of genome-wide functionality, we have been bold and confident enough to make predictions that, yes, the vast majority of the genome is functional and will prove to be functional through years and years of extensive testings, including knockout tests, okay, and other types of tests. You can even mutagenesis. You can mutate certain DNA sequences and see what the result is. Okay, so no one's ever said it's a fact, but it's so obvious because why else would the cell bother transcribing all this useless junk? Selection would have read this junk long ago. So obviously it's there for a reason, and we're confident enough to make predictions. Okay, which I don't see the critic here, Smokey, making. So here we go. This evidence has a trajectory suggesting that the vast majority of human DNA is in fact functional. With a few more years of experiments, here's the prediction, future testable prediction, the evidence for function will likely increase. In addition, this trajectory seems to be true of other species. As more functional testing has been performed in non-human species, more evidence for DNA function has accumulated. Hence, the long-held ideas of how DNA works and how much of it is functional have undergone a massive shift within the last decade. You see, I can almost predict that the critics have not read these articles and technical papers. There's lay articles like this, which you can read, and then there's technical papers that have it laid out for everybody in great detail. But what's funny is most of the critics aren't even reading the lay articles, which is why they've lost so badly, essentially. These results have profound ramifications for the speciation question. Since DNA now appears to be extremely functional, it would seem that the production of a new species would simply require a few DNA differences to arise. Fancy that, eh? In fact, as we observed earlier, millions of DNA differences separate species within a kind. A massive potential for speciation exists all over the planet. And we have paper after paper from non-coding RNAs to pseudogenes, as you can see here, all from secular papers, okay? Here's a bunch of papers on pseudogenes showing that they're necessary to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. They're essential endogenous retroviral functions. Okay. We have, I mean, it's undeniable the amount of papers that we have, even on ALUs, intronic ALUs, influence alternative splicing. Okay. Redundancy of the genetic code enables translational pausing. That's how I was talking about how we have even third position codon variation, which critics have often said was just neutral variation, but now we know it's functional variation. Okay. Protein mood lighting. You've got these proteins that have various functions, like kind of like a multifunctional tool. You got one protein that can do so many different things. Introns, the functional benefits of introns in genomes. Orphan genes. Here's a bunch of papers on the orphan genes. Epigenetics, as we talked about, Matt, you can even get into that. So therefore, this rapid change that we see, it's not surprising to the creationists because we expected it and we predicted it. So when Smokey says there's no evidence for design variation, he has no idea what he's talking about. And when they try and say that, you know, the genomes of certain species today, like bats, could never go back to a heterozygous ancestor, that's because the evolutionists are assuming that the vast majority of the genomes of living organisms, including bats, is junk and the result of evolutionary leftovers. That has been overturned. So the fact that Smokey would be so desperate to formulate an argument, to go to an evolutionist-based argument, which assumes junk DNA, which I've even got Dr. Fuzz Rana from Reasons to Believe coming on in a couple of weeks to show that the evidence does suggest genome-wide functionality, doesn't work. Doesn't work. We've made direct predictions that would flow naturally from the designed variation hypothesis. And as you can see here, something the critics don't do, something that Smokey doesn't do, we can go all day talking about the technical literature that supports our positions. Okay, look at this. Pseudogenes have long been labeled as junk DNA, failed copies of genes that arise during the evolution of genes, because evolutionists assume genetic baggage, genomic fossils, right? However, recent results are challenging this. Some pseudogenes appear to harbor the potential to regulate their protein coding counterparts. Now, I mean, we've done tons of shows on pseudogenes and on the function of the DNA code and the DNA language. There's one other one here too, Matt, and I know I've been long-winded, so I want to give you the floor. Signs, lines, ALU sequences. Look at this. One paper even suggested that repetitive ALU sequences might be involved in the development of higher brain function in humans. Numerous other functions have been discovered for various types of non-protein coding DNA, including repairing DNA, assisting in DNA replication, regulating DNA transcription, aiding in folding and maintenance of chromosomes, controlling RNA editing and splicing, helping to fight disease, regulating embryological development. I mean, the evidence for design diversity is overwhelming. It would take 10 hours to cover all the evidence, but you've got Smokey so desperate to have an argument that he says, what, Matt? There's no evidence for design variation. So that was long-winded. Matt, what are your thoughts, brother? Go ahead.
I don't even know what to say after that. Yeah. I'm still caught up, I guess, on the speciation thing. Like, can I share my screen real quick? You'll have to allow it. Actually, yeah, you have to pop it in. I hope everyone can see it. My screen's pretty large. So I typed in how many dinosaur species are there in the top. I've got 700. So if dinosaurs are anything like birds, I did the numbers for everybody right here. So I would say that if there were 50 to 55 dinosaur species, I think I've heard Dr. Jeanson say 55, but let's just go with 50. Let's make the numbers really easy for everybody. So I don't think it would be hard to imagine 50 becoming 700 species before the fall. Now, what I mean by that is if we do the math, we divide 700 by 1,500, which would be the minimum amount of time from creation to the flood. Obviously, I believe it's longer, 25, but who cares? I digress. This would require one dinosaur kind to speciate every 2.5 years. That would be if God only created one dinosaur. Now, clearly, God didn't make just one. He made multiple. So if there was 50 families, now we're looking at each family having one speciation event every 14 years. Considering dinosaurs were most like birds and laid eggs, then think about that number. What do we know today about birds? We've ran those numbers. Remember, I've showed everybody. Birds were speciating at about 3.4 years. They were having a new one. That's more than enough for dinosaurs to speciate. Now, obviously, birds aren't dinosaurs. And not only that, birds don't live as long as dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were much larger, and they lived longer. So it explains why we see less dinosaurs. But birds don't live very long. They have a lower generation time, so we would expect a faster generation time. But the reason I said because they're similar to birds in the fact that they lay eggs, why would they not have a fast speciation rate? I hope that's understandable, SFT. So to me,
well, I'm just wondering then, Matt, if you're right, how come there's not thousands of species of finch on the Galapagos Island?
Oh, not that again.
I just wanted to throw that out there because what's funny is Smokey's the one that made that argument so confidently, and we demolished it. We decimated it for 2.5 hours the other day. He pretended that he never even made that. He didn't even comment on it, didn't even correct himself, didn't even admit, oops, yeah, that's a silly argument. This is what we're dealing with, Matt. But anyways, yeah, keep going, brother. Great points. Great points.
Oh, no, I was just saying that if we're only looking at 700 dinosaur species total before they were wiped out, that's a really low number, which goes to show you that, again, when they were counting species, when he gave that number of 250,000, obviously I trust what he says. I didn't look into it, but the number's fine because most species are in life forms that are small. They're worms, they're slugs, they're squid, they're things that don't live long, that live like ants, for example. Look how many ants there are. There's 12,000 species of ants. So most of the species of that 250,000 are insects. So that explains it. It's short-lived life. Did you pop something up on the screen?
Yeah, Godzilla Freak. He made a good point. He says, why are speciation rates then, by the measure of 20 years, not resulting in thousands of finches? So he's making a joke again. Sorry to distract you.
Oh, okay.
Anyways, keep going, brother.
Okay. Let me see. I took some notes. Oh yeah, another thing was yeah, I find that we have a lot of evidence, but we always don't have the complete nail in the coffin. And what I mean by that is, take, for example, Mary Schweitzer. She wanted to say if she's really looking at dinosaur DNA. Now, because DNA corrodes so quickly, she was like, this can't be DNA. So she ran 8 individual tests that were separate to determine if it was dinosaur DNA. All 8 of them passed, meaning it was dinosaur DNA. The only thing that's left to do is something that her lab can't do, which is sequencing data. It's very expensive and her lab can't do it. So they were like, well, every other secular scientist goes, well, it's not dinosaur DNA. She goes, well, it's passed every test I've run. They're like, did you sequence it? She's like, oh, well, no. So they go, yeah, it's not it. So they're not going to sequence it. You see what we're dealing with a lot of times? This has nothing to do with Smokey, but I'm just saying that most people say if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, well, it's a duck. Well, Mary Schweitzer's like, well, not only looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it tastes like a duck, it flies like a duck, it sits like a duck, it sleeps like a duck, and
but it's not a duck.
Yeah, so fairly certain it's a duck. But everyone goes, no, it can't be true. But the evidence we keep showing people is, man, we have a lot of evidence on our side, and this is what we're predicting, and this is what we're seeing. And they just keep telling, the evolutionists keep saying no. So it gets really hard to contend with people that just go, I want every bit of evidence. And it's like, we can't supply you with every bit. We can give you a huge chunk, but I mean, how much more do you need? Now, here's a question. If speciation doesn't happen, then how do we have so many dog breeds? Obviously, it's not a speciation event because it didn't happen naturally in the wild, but we literally made these dogs from wolves.
Right.
So obviously a Chihuahua wasn't on the ark, and if it
And
was,
through pre-existing
threw
means.
it off. What?
And through pre-existing means, like pre-existing DNA differences, is how these breeds came about.
Exactly.
Just take those DNA differences, they artificially select for certain traits. So therefore, if the original archetypes had pre-existing differences as well, which the evidence seems to suggest, then just like we see with the rapid formation of new breeds, just like we see on the farm, as we pointed out last time and got no response to, we've got 700 to 800 breeds of horses and donkeys, and yet only 7 equid species. The 700 to 800 breeds came about during human history. Even the evolutionists would agree with that. But apparently, it took millions of years for the species of equids. But remember, critics, you need the millions of years because you need the millions of years to build up the genetic variation. Sorry, but the evidence suggests the variation was pre-existing.
Right.
Anyways, go ahead, brother.
No, like I was saying earlier, well, they made a hybrid, which was considered a new species, literally from a male lion and a female tiger, and created the liger. And then they reversed it and used the female lion and the male tiger, and they got the tigon. So they created 2 new species in 1 generation. And then they could let them out in the wild, and you've got essentially a new species walking around. But again, it would be like, I guess they could say that this is fine. It's just, these are just examples of something that already exists. But I think they believe that our model has a problem because we require a lot of species after the flood, and they don't have to worry about it at all because those species were already there. So we just have a different outlook on that. Not really a contention to say like, this is why old Earth is wrong or anything like that. It's just, it's a different model when it comes to speciation.
I would say they have a huge problem because unless they want to say that the creation of animals are also young, go back just 6,000 years based on the barcoding study. But a lot of them will say, okay, humans are young, but animals go back even longer. Well, now they have a problem, as we've pointed out, for a number of reasons. Adaptive episodes occur rapidly. So that means when we look at the numbers, as you can see here, there's far too few species. The species correlates perfectly with 4,500 years since the flood. But if some old earthers want to say, no, these species, and their ancestors go back hundreds of thousands to millions of years, then the question becomes, well, based on what we know about epigenetics and the rapid adaptation that can occur through new environments, then they should have more species. And I don't find the old Earth creationists are making any predictions on speciation events, speciation rate. So that's what I would say is their issue. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, I have a question too. Maybe you could answer it for me. My question would be, he said that we have a problem with the genome size, which I'm sure we can get to because you mentioned that about bats. So we're going to answer that. But wouldn't there be hundreds of examples of that if it was actually a problem? Why only a bat?
Exactly. And remember that argument, like when I debated CRISPR on it, he's an evolutionist.
Yeah.
So I pointed out in that debate like 3 years ago, I said, you're assuming that the vast majority of the genome is junk anyways. So oftentimes they're just looking to the functional portions, assuming the rest of it is just meaningless. No. Now we actually, and then we ended up debating junk DNA for the next hour. 3 years ago. But now we know that there's so much information in the genomes of all living species that is in compressed form. And we know through a number of processes, as we've talked about, including epigenetics, including these variation-inducing genetic elements, we know for a fact that this information that's in compressed form can then be decompressed and revealed as adaptive change. So there's a lot of genetic information and adaptive potential in the genomes of all living organisms. And the design diversity hypothesis would suggest that there was a lot of engineering at play. God would have engineered into life this ability to change and the ability to change, the capacity would have at the start, a lot of it would have been in that compressed form. And that's why we have so many mechanisms. I love the way Dr. Rob Carter puts it in one of his articles about new information. He says, when the genetic information is decompressed, deciphered, revealed, or unscrambled, okay, this can reveal new traits. It can lead to rapid adaptation, but it's no evidence for bacteria to biologist evolution. Okay. Now this part I'm adding in. This isn't evidence for large scale bacteria-like organism to biologist evolution because that information is already there. If you have a mechanism that's decompressing compressed information to be revealed for adaptive purposes, that's not evidence for fish to fisherman evolution. The information is already there. The capacity is already there. Okay. So just like your computer, your laptop, I mean, you can have a file within a file within a file. You can have so many files and data, and with your computer, I mean, your computer is overloaded with information. I mean, people laugh at your desktop all the time. Is your computer just going to explode? It's just ridiculous. Plus we know, okay, if we look at the bat species today, man, give me your thoughts. Because Smokey's just repeating arguments. That's it. Arguments that have been debunked, right? This bat one's a joke. Natural selection sorts out genetic information. Go back 6,000 years. Creationists look back to the expansion of genetic information. Evolutionists look back to the contraction. Total opposites. So when Smokey says we believe in hyperevolution, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know the basics. So we look back to the expansion of genetic information. Okay, God would have created at creation populations of animals, populations of bats, populations of birds, many different kinds of birds, many different kinds of bats, whatever. We don't necessarily know. We just know that they're created in bulk. Then archetypes are brought to the ark. Okay, these bottlenecks were one generation followed by rapid and exponential growth, which means very little amount of the original heterozygosity would have been lost. A lot of that information is in compressed form, mind you. Now, over the next few thousand years, 4,500 years, when you get new species generating, that original genetic information is being sorted out among the different species. A lot of genetic information is being lost. Just like we showed Alexei Kondrashov, a lot of genes are missing completely in the human genome. So you want to look to the bat genome and make assumptions on how the bat archetype was at the flood, and then making another false assumption on how the original created bats were thousands of years before that. It's a weak argument. It doesn't make any sense, and it shows a strong misunderstanding of how natural selection can sort genetic information, and how shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity means you're going from a state of more diversity to less diversity, which means a lot of the diversity is lost. So you can't look at the horse genome today and look at the levels of heterozygosity in the horse genome and assume that's exactly how the horse archetype, their genome was at the flood. Matt, point this out. Horse equid genomes thousands of years ago in the past, there was more heterozygosity, wasn't there? Genomes were bigger. Anyways, yeah. I said my thoughts there. I know I said a lot. So what are your thoughts on that argument then? Go ahead.
That's actually how I was able to determine what horse was probably on the ark. I traced genome size and chromosome to the highest one. And I said, if that's the one that's the highest and has the most, then maybe if the animals got off the ark and they migrated and speciated, we'll see a loss in genome size. And if not a loss in genome size, a loss of chromosomes. And that's what I found. And I also found it moving away from a central area. So I was like, this must be what we see. This must explain it. So it helped me to put an animal at least the most near where the ark was. Obviously I can't be certain if that animal's on the ark for one reason, and that's because if the animal got off and then died, obviously we won't know. For example, the dire wolf. We know that the dire wolf was on there because we find them in the north with the woolly rhinoceros and the woolly mammoth. So they went north, they died. Now, is the dire wolf a species of wolf? Sure, it is. So did it come first or did it come after? Not sure, because it's dead. We don't have its genome. We can't really tap into it and see its chromosome numbers and count. It's all messed up with the DNA. So there's a lot of problems. Everything that went north got inbred, got their genome messed up. So now it's time to talk about bats. So bats will be fun, unless you want to go in on that real quick. Should we? Okay, I'm going to go for it. So again, what would cause something like a bat to lose genome size? Again, we would have lots of diversity. We would have bats migrating. They can fly, so that's what happened. They flew out to all regions of the world. Bats are on every continent. And then we have fast generation types. We have speciation rates that are pretty high in bats. And well, we know that the average generation time is around 8 years. We found some are as low as 2, and some go up to 15. Now, if we're looking at a flood being 4,500 years ago, then we're looking at about 300 generations for a 15-year-old bat, and we're looking at a generation of 562 for a 8-year bat. So now we have a lot of time for such a few amount of species of bats. I actually did the numbers and have that in the book, but I'll share that with everybody in a minute. But what we're getting at now is we have bats that have fast generation times and have speciated and lost parts of their genome size. So we've lost a lot. Now, how can I know? Because there's 2 types of bats that exist. One has sonar and one does not. The ones that have sonar eat insects, and the ones that don't have it anymore eat fruit. Pretty simple, right? But did you know when we go back in time and we dig down, we find an extinct bat? It was probably on the ark because it's not very deep and it's not even really fossilized, because we can get the DNA from it. Now, here's the cool thing about this bat. It's awesome. This bat had both. It had everything, basically. This bat was really cool. It's a giant burrowing bat. That's how you can type it in online to find this thing. I can also share the information that I have. But it could walk, it could fly, it could burrow into the ground. It ate both fruit and insects, had sonar, and great vision and hearing. And we're not even to the cool part yet. So it lived in trees. It also lived on the ground, which, by the way, modern bats can't do. A bat can only fly if it falls off, drips down, catches the air, and lifts off the ground. If you throw a bat on the ground and you watch it, it'll crawl around and try to get up because they can't take off from the ground. This bat can. This ancient bat was way superior. So we go back in the time, we again see more superiority. Pretty cool, if you ask me. So unlike bats today that only have sonar or vision that's good, they can see a lot of colors for fruit, and they can see at night because both are nocturnal. This one had both. It had great vision, great hearing, and sonar. It's incredible. So unlike most bats today that are that are flying, this one was ground dwelling mostly. It liked to be on the ground, and it could fly from there. So it had better flight capabilities, better movability. It burrowed in the ground. That's incredible. Anyway, again, superiority. They named the bat Vulcanopterus after the Roman giant god. So pretty cool yet again. Now, a matter of fact, I'm going to share screen. Why not? Hopefully you're there to share it with everybody. But oh, good. I hope everyone can see this. I think I can make it larger by one more time. Yep, 200. Okay, so here is the category of bats. You're looking at how many species there are. There's 1,240 different species of bats that have been categorized into 2 different types. So when we look around the world, I go, let's just say that there's this many. How many bats, how fast do they speciate? Well, between every 3 to 5 years on average. That's okay. Well, if you do the math back to the flood, does that not perfectly line up? I'm going to say this alone destroys non-speciation alone, but it really, really vindicates ours. In 2015, they found 2 bat species. They found 2. These are the types of them. Here's the studies and the links I can share with everybody if you're interested. So here's another thing. If they if evolutionists are listening, again, has nothing to do with Smokey. He believes species are fixed, and so they're not going to get any more or any less unless they go extinct. But if they believe that species are occurring at this rate, well, big trouble. If you go back 200,000 years ago, you've got 800,000 bats. 800,000. Now, remember, bats can go anywhere on Earth that they want to. They can fly. It's not like they go, well, I can't get to Australia. Nope, they can get there, no problem. So where's the extinction level of bats? It doesn't matter. You can cut them in half, and you can cut them in half, and then cut them in half, and cut them in half, and cut them in half, and cut that in half, and they're still not near this few bat species. So again, I think we can explain the bat diversity we see. We have a better bat in history. Unfortunately, we don't have its genome yet because it's not fossilized. It doesn't mean we won't. They just found this thing. So that's really good for us. What do you think about that news?
Amazing data, brother. Amazing. I was just telling the chat that for each one of these arguments that we're demolishing and addressing, as you can see here, it's all backed up by just so much data, right? It's all backed up by the numbers, the technical papers. We've got predictions. It's why we can not devolve our videos into just nonsense. I mean, we go minus the intros and some of the jokes at the beginning of our shows. But once we get into it, Matt, what do? It's hours of nonstop data. It's why they can't address it. It's why they can't play a video and actually address it line by line and match our predictions, match the technical papers we're putting forth.
Well, I don't think they know how much time I literally spend doing this, and you as well. I research like crazy. When you said bats, you know how much research I was able to just grab from existing content because I've already run the numbers? I ran these numbers for Christians. I ran this to help you guys have arguments against evolution. And now look, we have to argue against other Christians. This doesn't even make sense to me. This was done to show you guys you have an argument to defeat evolution. Don't side with them. That's pagan. I hate evolution. It's stupid. I feel ashamed to have believed in it for so many years. It's ridiculous. We have so many different things pointing to, like, literally where you can take the numbers like was just done with the bats, and you can go, well, what do we know? We know quite a bit. People love animals. People will study them. Like, there's specialists for like just bats. There's people that like go out and they just watch birds through a thing and they're like, well, look at that one, that species. And they document it down. They're addicted to these things. So we know when there's as much information as we can gather, we have recently. So it's pretty cool that we can line these numbers up and go, well, do they actually point to a recent flood or not? And since the numbers keep doing that, we have to assume, one, that it was global, because why did the numbers keep pointing to everything being that time? But if we didn't believe in speciation, we couldn't run these numbers. So I don't really know how that model works. If there is a model like this that we have, I want to see those numbers because that would be cool. Because other than that, I'm just arguing from my standpoint and always giving them my views rather than them sharing their model with us. Like I said, old Earth creation is fairly new to me.
And remember, this model of created heterozygosity that these critics want to attack, especially if you're a Christian, it doesn't make any sense for you to hold to designed organisms, designed species, but not designed internal diversity. It's us as young Earth creationists that are able to have a model. And from this specific model, when we look to just this simple heterozygosity, just look to Adam and Eve. They've got DNA differences between them and within them. And with that internal diversity results in what? All the ethno-linguistic differences we see today. We know that we can produce incredible variation in one generation just due to this built-in diversity. And his claim that something to do with we don't know the archetypes, or I mean something that RJ Downard said, we don't know the original genomes. Go back to my debate with RJ Downard. It was Adam and Eve or human evolution on Modern Day Debate. He made that claim. And it was near the end of the discussion, I completely threw him off. He had no idea about, for one, the data, the hat map data, where, and I'm going to quote, Rob Carter points out, the human genome is young because shared blocks of DNA are large and there has not been enough time to scramble them to randomness. So we pointed out, and I asked this question, Aaron Ra, in his debate with Dr. Charles Jackson, he had no idea what I was talking about, is we can look to linkage blocks. We know every single generation we get recombination, we can get gene conversion as well, which scrambles up these DNA differences, right? So we can actually look in the human genome and we can see shared blocks of DNA that have never experienced any kind of shuffling. And therefore, these shared blocks of DNA that are large, okay, is evidence that the genome is young because there's not been hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years of scrambling, of recombination, of gene conversion. So as young Earth creationists, we can look to those large blocks of DNA and we can actually determine what the original genomes were like. We can look to molecular clocks. We can look to allele frequencies. As we've pointed out, if we have an allele that is common, not disease causing, and beneficial or essential or functional in some way, then we can identify that as a created allele, right? When you have rare alleles that are oftentimes disease causing, that are not beneficial or functional in any way, then we can rightly conclude that these are alleles due to mutation. And all of this has been laid out in technical paper after technical paper. But the critics are so out of date and out of touch with reality that they don't know any of this. They don't know what they're dealing with. And that's why when they try and present these arguments, what happens, Matt? They get buried. And I've got so many slides, but okay, here's a good slide I've been looking for. So let me see here. I'm going to screen share. This is why our model, our starting point, as we start to wind this down, brother, because this will be now a 4-hour series right here. We can actually determine through molecular clocks, through DNA function, through these linkage groups like we were talking about, okay? Something the old earthers and the theistic evolutionists don't do. We can actually determine what are the kinds, what is related and what's not. That's why I typically like to debate the bigger picture, universal or separate ancestry. So for Smokey to make that claim shows once again he has no idea what he's talking about. And we have been able to do that where it's most important with humans, okay? We can go as close to home as possible. We've been able to determine what's related and what's not. We know what's part of the humankind, mostly based on genetics. Genetics is what's inherited sperm and egg. Genes, traits, and genetics are inherited sperm and egg, not a bone, not geography, okay? Not a fossil, but genes. So we've been able to determine that the humankind is young. We know from the fossil groups, Denisovans, Neanderthalensis, Erectus, I'd say Luzonensis as well, Heidelbergensis, Naledi, Floresiensis, which is the hobbits. Okay, these are your extinct fossil groups. The old Earth model has a ridiculous, an absolutely ridiculous idea of what is and what isn't human. Okay, these side branches that went extinct due to inbreeding, founder effects, island dwarfism, okay, rapid mutation accumulation due to inbreeding, which can explain a lot of these features, especially these island humans that have the island dwarfism, like Naledi, hobbits, Luzonensis. They all have very similar features because that's what happens when you become isolated on an island. So we know that you'd have Adam and Eve down here. You'd have the flood somewhere here. Okay. You'd have some people groups branch off. They become isolated, inbred. Inbreeding exposes the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. And that's why they have a lot of these anomalous features. They go extinct. And now we have humans today. You see, we have a nice coherent model from our starting point. That's why young Earth creationists actually destroy the evolutionists the best, because we actually have a model. Then we can go into your Australopith-like ancestors, orangutan ancestors, chimp-like ancestors, gorilla-like ancestors. We can get into your different Australopithecines like Africanus, Afarensis. We can point out what's artificial, like habilis and Sediba. So we actually can do this. We can do this with species as well, based on molecular clocks and DNA differences, DNA function. I mean, we actually have a model. It's fun to be a young Earth creationist, Matt, right? I mean, are we not always studying? Are we not always improving the model? Are we not always reading a new technical paper? I mean, it really is the most consistent model is the young Earth creation model. And I think that's why young Earth creationists are hated so much. So
yeah.
Veckel brother, he asks, I have a question. Is there any evidence of human fossils that were involved in the flood? Ooh, Matt, you love that one, brother. You want to answer that?
I do. Yes. We have a video on the channel. It's probably in the deep history now because of the thousands of videos we have, but it's really good. It's on the Ashley phosphate beds of South Carolina. You see there's only one layer there. I mean, there's a layer of sand, of course, but there's actual one layer of phosphate, and that's all that exists. And if you look in that fossil layer, that single layer, there you will find that they found a human right next to a hadrosaur dinosaur jawbone. And so, I mean, they found more human remains as well, but they were throwing them in the river because they were afraid of their discoveries getting them in trouble. And this is a while ago. This is in the 1800s. So they go into the phosphate beds because it's a great resource for money. And they were getting it because phosphate is used in gardening. And you can use it for growing your garden, and everything grows much faster with the phosphate. So they were harvesting the phosphate. And the geologists went there to go look because they kept finding multiple creatures. I mean, talking like 50-foot shark. I mean, massive creatures. Megalodons. They found mammoth. I think it was anyway. Anyway, they found all kinds of creatures and dinosaurs and man. So there's your no dinosaurs ever been found with a man. Yeah, it has. It's just not very well known. So we have evidence of the footprints and the dinosaur drawings and those things like that, but the real evidence comes to the fossil record, and that would be your best bet. And it's written in a book. Matter of fact, he drew on the cover of the book a man standing next to a hadrosaur dinosaur because the evidence was overwhelming. So pretty good for a secular guy to do that, right? Being worried about being ridiculed and mocked, but they kept finding so many human bones that there was no way to deny it anymore. Sorry, so much noise.
Great response. So that being said, guys, I want to say we're now going on 2 hours. We've done a part 1 and a part 2. So I'm gonna point out that we've taken down all his arguments that were really just repeated talking points. He answered none of our challenges, really nothing. He really is low-hanging fruit. I think everybody can see that. This will be the last. It's a 2-part series. This is the last time we'll even respond to his repeated talking points. Now he's very desperate, very desperate. You can hear it in his voice. Okay, sure, he's going to dedicate another, I'm sure, a bunch of streams where he's going to go look up arguments that we've already destroyed. Okay, yeah, praise is right. He got wrecked. I mean, it's not good for him. Okay, so all we've had is a repeating of already debunked arguments. We've given technical papers, predictions, retrodictions, data. He's provided nothing. Okay, it's the Smokey Saint comedy show. This is the last response that we're going to do. It's been a lot of fun. We really only did it because, I mean, these are the same talking points that are brought up in comment sections all the time. Do we dedicate streams every time a talking point is brought up that we've debunked 1,000 times? We don't have time for that. We have a million projects. We're doing full-time ministry. This new official website is going to be done soon. Got a ton of great shows, books that we're writing. So that's it. Okay. I assure you, and I predict if there are any other arguments, they're either going to be arguments repeated. There's going to be no challenges answered, no predictions of his own. He's going to say something like, oh, we're debunking something that's not his model. That's because he doesn't understand his model. He doesn't understand the changes behind speciation events. He doesn't understand much, actually. Now, this has hopefully been an education session for him, maybe some other critics, and hopefully they can admit they were wrong, admit correction, or at least attempt to address some of these challenges. But addressing this low-hanging fruit any further would, I believe, and maybe I can get the opinion of anybody in the chat, maybe praise, I believe it would actually, at this point, start hurting the channel. Because we strive to run a professional channel. We run professional interviews. We don't curse. We don't use profanity. Okay. When you go over to this specific individual's channel, there's nothing but cursing. There's nothing but ad hominems. There's a lot of ranting, very little arguments. You never see any technical papers being presented. You never see any numbers. You never see any data. Exactly. Waste of time. These last two streams have been fun because we've been able to address a lot of talking points that have been addressed, but maybe not in a while. So for new subscribers, people that are just joining, or maybe people that, because oftentimes it is good to get a refresher. Okay. So I still think it was beneficial. These last two streams, we've been able to, kind of rehash a lot of data points, touch on a few new things. So Godzilla Freak says there are bigger guys to take. Exactly. I mean, go to his channel, his 4 or 5 response videos. He thinks he's exposing Team Standing for Truth to the world. All 4 of them combined still haven't equaled out to, our one response that we did, which is over 1,000 views. Now, I want to let people know views don't matter. Things like that don't matter when it comes to the truth. The point is no. There's no exposing going on. The only exposing going on would be the exposing of his really, really bad and laughable arguments. That channel has certain people on there that blaspheme the Lord, use the Lord's name in vain. We like to keep this channel professional. So we've got a special guest, though, okay? The last 10 minutes, Matt, and I think you'll like this, since this is the last time we are going to address Smokey, because as Godzilla Freak said, there's way bigger people. We've got videos from people like Aaron Raw that we actually have to get to. Simon Dan, people that actually, well, I mean, they have just as bad arguments, but at least they have, what do you think, Matt? A bigger audience that can see the refutations. So I'm going to send the link to a special guest who's going to just come in here, since this is the last time we're going to be dealing with Smokey. He's been demolished, but there's one argument that we've been, I'm going to send it to your email, brother CJ, and he's going to, and Matt, it'll be awesome to get your thoughts on this too. There's one argument that, a very desperate argument pertaining to Yom, that has been put forth by this critic. So we're just going to have the final 10 minutes. We're just going to kind of leave no stone unturned, deal with that, and then we're done. These 2 episodes are out there for people to see, share around, and the arguments will never be addressed. Never. It's pretty well impossible for him to do so, because he just doesn't. When you don't, right, Matt? Unfortunately, when you don't know the basics of speciation, how can you then argue for or against speciation? How does that make sense, Matt?
Well, they don't believe in it at all, so they never investigated it. Problem solved. Just don't care about it at all.
I find it such a weak argument, because even as a young earth creationist, we would admit that you can link, Canis domesticus, Canis lupus, Canis coyotes. You can link those to a common ancestor. You can link the black bear, the polar bear, the brown bear. You can link these to a common ancestor.
Right. Just like humans to another human. It's paternity testing. We can go back, but you notice we don't go back to an ape of any kind.
Right. Exactly. We can show separate ancestry, but these old earth creationists that say like all these different species were created and that's it, there's stasis, that was refuted by Darwin. The fixity of species is a joke.
Even young Earth creationists recognize that simple phylogenetic systematics refutes that. That's why a lot of them have to say, well, Neanderthalensis were a separate creation and they were, they were an animal and there's bestiality going on and all this nonsense. It's like we literally have their genes. We can, through phylogenetic systematics, molecular clock data, DNA function data, we can link house cats, lions, tigers to a common ancestor. But these old earthers, unfortunately, putting forth this fixity of species, Darwin destroyed that himself. We've never believed in fixity of species. Ever-changing environments, Matt, requires ever-changing genomes, requires adaptability. Fixity of species is just, it's indefensible. As we wait for our special guest to join, brother. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we can see change fairly quick, even without speciation. I mean, look at the different so-called races of people, right? You can, the ones that went to Africa, well, they better tan really, really quickly to get used to that being near the equator. You move away from the equator, well, guess what? You're going to need some vitamin D. So if you've got dark skin, it better lighten up, because you're gonna require it, especially females, for the production of milk. And what do we find? Females everywhere on Earth are always more pale than the men of that region, because they have to be. So we see a natural adaptation from just through environmental factors, right? So it seems to me that adaptation is a fairly quickly thing, and we see it right in front of our eyes. You
can't deny it, right? And that's why we always say, don't look at the phenotype, look at the genotype. Oh, you believe in hyperevolution. Oh, really? Really? A reduction in genetic information is hyperevolution. Well, I mean, seriously, is this what we're dealing with here? Reduction of evolution. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, you have to remember, though, young Earth creation is very scientific. Look at how much we have to study to know it. So right. If you were to know somebody and tell them about young Earth creation, you could talk to them for probably a day or two. They would go out and not have any idea how to defend it whatsoever. So to become a young Earth creationist and to defend it, it takes a lot. It takes a lot of time, a lot of memorization of things. You have to like multiple fields of science, which if you don't like geology, well, guess what? You're not going to be able to defend a flood ever. You just can't. If you don't like genetics and biology, you're not going to know separate ancestry. There's no way. So I can understand why people don't want to be a young Earth creationist personally, because how do you defeat radiometric dating when you don't know anything about it? It's much easier just to say, well, I guess the Earth is old and humans are young, because we'll just go with the molecular clocks. We'll just go with the pedigree studies and we'll say that humans are young. But the Earth, I don't know how to defeat radiometric dating, so Earth is old. See, you have to really dig in deep in all the different sciences to get young Earth creation, and it's a lot for people. So I can see why they're just fine going, who cares? It's non-salvational. Let's move on. Let's talk about other things. So I can understand it.
Which is why there's ministries out there, one being us, where you have people like us who don't mind the full-time study of the scientific data so we can present it to you. And therefore, if you're going up against one of these bullies or anti-YECs and they bring up an argument, we're happy to help. We're happy to give a video, an article, a book. I mean, we do our best to answer all these objections, challenges. We enjoy it. So that being said, we are going on 2 hours. So CJ, good to have you, brother. Always a pleasure. CJ did, and maybe you can kind of, in a nutshell, explain it and then debunk it. You did a video a while back addressing a challenge actually put forth by Smokey. I really enjoyed that video. I really enjoyed your answer. So I wanted to have you on tonight to kind of, I guess, reiterate the argument and then show why the argument fails. And that way, this two-part, I guess, series, you can call it, we feel like we left no stone unturned with the science and then also the scripture, CJ. So thanks for being here, brother.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you sending me the link there real quick. Briefly, for those who don't know, I have a much more detailed takedown of this particular argument on my channel. It's titled Bad Arguments for an Old Earth, Refuting Smokey Saint. And it's the video that Brother SFT was actually just referencing. So if you guys want to check that out, it's like a full 2 hours. Only about 1 hour is dedicated to this argument. The next hour is opening the room. I talk with Rob a lot, but nonetheless, it's a full flesh out of what's going on here. So Smokey has an argument which he believes is a knockdown, single punch, haymaker to the teeth kind of argument that completely obliterates and destroys and demolishes and incinerates and etc. Young Earth creationism. And of course, every argument that Smokey Saint has ever made is that flawless and wonderful, if you haven't heard. But nonetheless, I decided to go after this particular argument. So basically what he says is there are 4 different literal definitions of the word yom, which is the Hebrew word for day. And that these are the work day, basically, so part of the daylight hours, all of the daylight hours, full 24-hour period, or an indefinite period of time, right? Which this is, of course, common reason to believe talking point. And his argument basically is that if you go to the Hebrew culture, they understand a 24-hour period of time differently from us, right? Not from we. That doesn't make any sense, right? But differently from us, right? So in not understanding it from morning to morning, and also not understanding it as a strictly 24-hour period, because they don't have as precise timekeeping techniques. The way they would understand it is actually sundown to sundown, or evening to evening, right? Now that much is actually true, by the way. That is how the Jews to this day actually understand a day, is from sundown to sundown, right? So Smokey Saint's argument is, since the Jews understand a day as sundown to sundown, when we see evening to morning in Genesis, we can't understand that as a full day, because literally that would either be 12 hours, the first morning to the first evening, or 36 hours, the first morning through the first evening and the second morning onto the second evening, right? Which obviously doesn't work, but that's his particular argument. So recap, basically, there's 4 literal definitions of the word yom. And if you understood the context of what a 24-hour day was, according to the Jews back in this time, you would understand that it's impossible for one of these definitions, namely the 24-hour period of time, to actually work in the text. So that's the argument, right? A couple problems with that. The first problem is this is a very blatant example of what I call mystification. Mystification can take very many forms, but in this particular example, mystification is taking the form of trying to make yourself seem like an authority by presenting knowledge that people would not generally know. So in this particular case, the knowledge that people would not generally know is what the literal uses of the Hebrew word yom is, right? Hebrew word yom is day. And the literal usages, again, are a part of the daylight hours, namely the work day, all of the daylight hours, the 24-hour period of time, or an indefinite period of time, right? And again, this is something people wouldn't usually know. So they can drop this information on you, and then you start to kind of let your guard down, thinking to yourself, oh, so I don't really understand what exactly a day is in the Hebrew context, and this person clearly does. I need to respect them as an authority. The problem with that is that the English word day has the exact same 4 literal definitions. I'm currently reading from the dictionary. If you look up day definition, number 1, a period of 24 hours is a unit of time reckoned from one midnight to the next, corresponding to a rotation of the earth on its axis. Number 2, the part of the day when it is light, the time between sunrise and sunset. Number 3, the part of a day spent working. Number 4, a particular period of the past, an era. In other words, going to the Hebrew and calling this the yom argument is completely ridiculous, because it just so happens that the word yom and the English word day are actually literal equivalents. This doesn't always happen in different languages, but a lot of times you do have words that are used in the exact same ways, both literally and idiomatically. And in the case of yom and day, we have that occurring. So that's the first problem, right? Just retreating to the Hebrew in this instance doesn't actually matter. The second problem with this is the whole argument is predicated on this idea: if you understood this like a Hebrew, if you understood this like a Hebrew, if you understood this like a Hebrew, right? But all of the Hebrews understood this to be a literal 24-hour period of time, or at least most of them. Certainly you can't say all. Moses Maimonides, for example, and Rabbi Akiva did not believe in a literal 24-hour day when it came to the 6 days of creation, right? But the overwhelming majority of them certainly did. one of the best examples is the Seder Olam, and the Seder Olam is actually the current basis for the modern day Jewish calendar, right? So if you've ever seen a Jewish calendar and it said something like, I think it's like 5788 right now after creation, that's actually based off of a first century text known as the Seder Olam, where the rabbis came together, they looked at the text, they calculated how old the earth was, and then, established the Jewish calendar as a result of that. That obviously was not only something that came from the first century, but was so well established and well accepted that it is to this day the Jewish calendar that is in use, not only for their holy days, but even in their nation state of Israel, right? In other words, it was accepted by the majority both at that time and now as an accurate rendition of what the scripture was trying to teach. Translation. If you understood this like the Hebrews did, you would come to the conclusion that the earth was young. Why? Because that's the conclusion the Hebrews actually came to. Again, see Seder Olam. The other really big problem with this argument is that it's just a basic matter of chains, right? So first off, it doesn't really matter to say, oh, well, the Hebrews reckon a day different than we do. They go from evening to evening. Well, fun fact, we actually kind of do the same general thing. We go from morning to morning, right? It goes from 12 a.m. to 12 p.m. to 12 a.m. to 12 p.m. to 12, so on and so forth, right? By the way, you might have just gotten a little hint as to how we're going to solve Smokey's problem. It goes evening to morning. And then what comes after morning? Evening, then morning. And then what? Evening and morning, right? In other words, you have a chain connected, and we know that this chain is being connected because the text continues and tells us there's evening, there's morning the first day. Then there's evening and morning a second time the second day. You can now connect these evening to morning to evening to morning to evening to morning, so on and so forth, right? And again, we know this is how the Jews understood it themselves because we have things like the Seder Olam and stuff of that nature to actually prove this to us, right? That's the basic gist of the response. If you want the full fleshed out hour-long response to that, I do have a video actually responding to this, but that's the basic gist of it. Is day means the same thing in both the Hebrew and English context, so it's an irrelevant mystification technique to even bring up the Hebrew word in the first place. Excuse me, I mixed up my second argument and my third argument. Also, we do have a chain of connection between the evening, morning, and then the second argument that we have being presented, of course, and this is the most obvious one, is it's just simply not true that the Jewish context says that this is that this can't be, right? And that's the important thing, can't be, right? Because you would think, and just give, I'll be brief with this, but I'll just give a quick example, right? If somebody said it was raining cats and dogs, and somebody who didn't understand English were to see that written down in a text somewhere, right? And this guy were to come to the text and were to say, no, it can't mean anything but literal raining cats and dogs, because that's the way the Americans would have understood it, right? What is this person arguing? He's saying that he is so sure that what we mean is literal cats and dogs falling out of the sky that it literally is impossible for you to come to the conclusion that it is not literal cats and dogs raining out of the sky. Now, we would obviously think that person is absurd because the overwhelming majority of us believe that that is an idiom that is not describing literal cats and dogs falling out of the sky. The self-same thing is going on here. In order for Smokey Saint's argument to work, the overwhelming majority of people who were in the Jewish context at this time would have to think, no, there's no way this could possibly be understood as a 24-hour day. The exact opposite is true. So with that, I would concede that. And I appreciate you allowing me the time to demolish that real quick, standing.
Oh, yeah. No, my pleasure. I appreciate you giving us your time to demolish that argument, and demolish you have. As praise I am said in the chat. Great job. That's an impressive argument, CJ. That is a fantastic response to a really bizarre argument. I'm curious. And what I want to do, brother, is I'm going to put that video, the full video, in the description box so people can go check that out, and also go subscribe, like and subscribe to CJ's putting out some great content. And CJ's actually going to be back here, I think, in a week or two, debating Sky Out on this same topic. So that's going to be a ton of fun. Now, has Smokey done what he has done to us and just pretty well ignored everything? when it comes to your response here?
It actually, so I made a prediction at the end of that video. Not the end of the video, but the end of my hour where I'm talking about that right before I move on to talking with Rob, where I said we were either going to see Smokey ignore this or go into a tirade reviling me. And he actually proceeded to make me a prophet twice because he did both things. He went into my comment section and reviled me, but then proceeded to ignore me and never actually respond to the arguments. So that was pretty fantastic, actually. Now, of course, that's a joke, but the point being, that Smokey actually did. Yeah, he did the whole shtick, right? I'm going to go in the comment section, revile everything, and then just say, well, I don't see an argument here. So clearly, and the funny thing is, too, Smokey likes to do this thing. It's a very funny intimidation tactic, but it doesn't work if you just ignore it. He likes to say this thing where it's like, well, we all have come to the conclusion that you've been debunked, and we all, right, and you're losing your credibility with us. It's like, who's this royal we you're talking about? Because I got Rob Rowe on my channel, and I'm texting Kenny Rhodes, and I'm about to debate Sky Out and Kent Hovind and Rand. I just wonder who this royal we you're speaking of is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's Smokey Saint and the voices inside of his head, but
it has to be the case. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. But here we are. I know we have gotten no response to what I've said there. I've gotten one from Kenny Rhodes, I think, in the debate I had with him on your channel. I think we talked about that for a little bit, but we might not have. I seem to remember we did, though, but I can't recall anything that was actually said.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic video you did, and you really laid it out beautifully here. We kind of made predictions as well as to how Smokey would respond or ignore. We made sure we were comprehensive, which is why it was such a blessing to have you as well to kind of finish it off with such an awesome dismantling of that argument. Matt, I'm curious if you've heard that argument, brother, before we kind of wind it down, and if you had any thoughts as well.
No, I love the calendar argument as well, because I always say that, did the Jewish people themselves not understand their own writing systems, and did they not understand, because their calendar literally is young Earth? So did they not figure out? I can understand the perception of the different cosmological calendars and things that they are, maps that they draw, because literally it says in one place, well, there's 4 corners of the earth, or there's pillars over here, but it's also round here and floats on nothing here. So they got a lot of cosmological stuff wrong. There's no doubt. But just genealogies themselves, why are the genealogies wrong? That's what I want to know, because that's how we figured out young Earth. It wasn't like somebody 100 years ago was like, let's do a molecular clock testing in humans. No, they just added the dates. And I think that's pretty much what you were saying too, is the calendar that they did when they read the scriptures was probably adding up the genealogies, right?
Yeah, and I do want to actually add really quick. It's important to note, because a lot of the more dishonest, and of course not all of them are dishonest, but a lot of the more dishonest ones will actually make the claim, this whole idea of young Earth creationism is a new American thing, right? You hear that actually quite frequently, unfortunately. It's a new and American thing, right? So not only is it modern, but it's regional, which is funny, actually. Standings in Canada right now, and Ken Ham's in Australia, but apparently it's American at any rate. The funny thing about that is the Seder Olam was written sometime between the years 50 and 150, right? So, it's possible that when the Seder Olam was being written, Paul was writing his letters, right, at the same time. That's how old this source is that we base this calendar off of, right? So it's not like this. And in fact, there's an article on Reasons to Believe that I think everybody should absolutely read, because Hugh Ross is not actually a dishonest person, in my personal opinion, at least. He's very wrong, but he's not dishonest. He wrote an article on Reasons to Believe titled "Coming to Grips with the Early Church Fathers' Perspective on Creation." Now, by the title, you can already kind of guess where this is going. The article is basically Hugh Ross admitting not only is day-age theory non-existent amongst both Jewish and Christian circles, but the very first Christian circles to get any old Earth understanding whatsoever are post-Enlightenment. Isaac Newton, Leonardo da Vinci, people of that nature, right? And by the way, it's important to note for both of those figures, they're not actually committed to an old Earth position. They're simply speculating, as the two were oft doing, right? Because they're very intelligent people. The point being, Leonardo da Vinci is an Italian man living 1,500 years after the fact. Are you going to take his word for it, or are you going to take the Jewish word for it and the early Christian word for it, and so on and so forth, right? And yeah, that's all I'd want to add there.
No, that's a great point. That's a great point. And Dr. Sarfati points that out in his book that I think I have behind me. Yeah, Refuting Compromise, great book. And I think Hugh Ross even had to go back on that, because I think at one point he was saying that there were some church fathers that that taught it, and Dr. Sarfati pointed out that that is wrong. And I just find it out because people like Smokey always to make an argument want to say, well, all the church fathers and all of the church throughout history believed this. But when it comes to this topic, you're saying nobody believed the day age or progressive creationism or theistic. I mean, these are all new inventions.
Yeah, not a single one. The only people you can find who have any recollection of it at all are Jews, which, to be fair, that is something that people will use to their advantage. They'll say, well, because, obviously Jews are 1st, 2nd century, so that's an early source. But then you still have the fact that these sources who did believe this, even though you got to understand, like Rabbi Akiva and Moses Maimonides are some of the most beloved figures in all of Judaism, right? And despite the amazing love that these figures receive in later Judaism, they still, the Jews, I mean, still conclude, yeah, their whole old Earth thing, it's garbage. And they go with the Seder Olam instead, which is written by a virtual nobody. The idea just kind of being there that they're not respecters of persons in this regard. They're respecters of truth. And in the Christian church, it's entirely non-existent until you get to the years after the Enlightenment.
Epic. Fantastic information, CJ. We got to have you on one day just for like a stream just dedicated to, demonstrating YEC from the Bible. So I appreciate it, brother. I appreciate your time. I'm going to put your video in the description box. We're going on almost 2.5 hours. We've done kind of a 2-parter, and then we're just done with the Smokey Saint comedy show. We got better things to do. So I appreciate you really just kind of helping us here to leave no stone unturned, for him to now just, as you pointed out, tirade ad hominem, ignore, not address any of the challenges. So, all right, brother, any final words? Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Any final words from you?
I'll just say, I'm going to be back on here pretty soon, potentially before the 9th. We'll see what happens. Obviously, there's open rooms sometimes and stuff like that, but at least on the 9th. Thank you again, and God bless you guys.
God bless you as well. Matt, my man, any final words, brother?
No, all good, man. We've been going way too
I know.
long.
I'm tired. I'm tired. We had John Mackay earlier for an hour and a half. We did this kind of spur of the moment, but we thought it was important. As Prey said, he'll bloviate. Yeah, but he's buried. We buried him. He buried himself. So that's it, guys. God bless you all. We appreciate you making this a lot of fun. Veckel, no problem. We'll premiere this probably in the next couple days on Young Earth Creation channel as well. So, and we'll be back actually Thursday, right, Matt? We're doing the biblical longevity presentation Thursday. Oh, yeah. We need a day tomorrow to get some behind the scenes stuff done, because we did do this 2-part series, a spur of the moment series, not something that was scheduled. So behind the scenes in terms of writing, getting the books ready, and as well as the website, and getting your presentation ready for biblical longevity. So thank you so much in the chat. Thanks for keeping it lively. God bless. Standing for Truth and Matt Man are out.